First Giovanni, revs! Captain, hold us, get a rope.
Put me line,
Put me line here, Balloon. Put me line there.
Get it up.
Put me line.
Load him up, load him pride.
Halt!
Shoulder arms.
Drop, backs! Action on the right!
Go!
Take available cover!
Get down low, boys, get down low.
Command's firing! Fire, boys!
The American Civil War was one of the most dramatic and crucial episodes in the history of our country. Our image of the Civil War is naturally dominated by the most dramatic and colorful parts of the period. The famous leaders, the grand strategies, above all, the great battles. When we think of the Civil War, it's usually these battles that we see. Grand pictures of swirling smoke, bright flags, and struggling masses of men. It's important to remember that the drama and tension of battle was really only a small part of the average soldier's life. The Civil War soldier, like soldiers throughout history, spent the great majority of his time doing things that were neither exciting nor dramatic. His days were often routine, sometimes unpleasant, regularly exhausting, and occasionally downright boring. But like most soldiers, he accepted the boredom and the drudgery of military life, along with the excitement of battle. He did his duty as he saw it, and for that we salute him. But who men? What made them accept the hard life of the soldier? What were they fighting for? The men who fought the American Civil War represented a cross-section of the population of America at the time. They were, for the most part, white, although late in the war many black soldiers, former Southern slaves, joined the Federal Army. Both Northern and Southern armies were mostly made up of men from rural or small-town backgrounds. Many of them were deeply religious, or they seemed so at any rate to modern observers. Most were native-born and Protestant, although the Union Army benefited from a sizable immigration in the 1840s and 50s of Irish and German Catholics. By 1863, both sides had begun drafting men to fill up the ranks of their armies. The men who rushed off to war in 1861, however, were volunteers. They went for a variety of reasons. For many Northerners, preserving the Union and putting down rebellion were the main motivating factors. Later in the war, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the abolition of slavery became a cause for some. Southerners were motivated by different reasons. Few rebels ever claimed to be fighting to preserve slavery, but abstract theories about states' rights probably didn't motivate the average Confederate either. The distrust and suspicion that had grown between North and South in the years before 1861 were especially strong in the South, which felt increasingly threatened by the growing industrial and political strength of the North. Many Southern soldiers seem to have fought out of a feeling of personal antagonism toward the North, and a feeling that they were defending their homes and way of life from a direct attack.
But soldiers have always tended to be practical men. Civil soldiers were generally much less concerned with questions of why they were fighting than with more pressing matters, like the question of what there might be on hand to eat and how soon the eating could be done. Though company or even regimental cookhouses were occasionally set up in long-term camps, the Civil War soldier, North or South, almost always cooked and ate with a small group of friends he called his mess. Informality was the rule for utensils and equipment. Every soldier carried a tin cup, a fork and a knife, and a plate or bowl. A small pot or skillet completed the cooking gear for the mess. What the Civil War soldier ate varied. Both armies had more or less regular issues of rations, which varied with time and location. And in addition, soldiers of both armies generally availed themselves of whatever the countryside could provide. As in most forms of material support, the Yankee usually had his Confederate counterpart in the amount and quality of the food he was issued. Most importantly, Northern soldiers almost always had a good supply of coffee. Coffee was a mainstay of the Civil War soldier. Hot and invigorating, it was brewed and consumed in great quantities whenever available. Coffee beans were issued green, then usually roasted in a tin cup held over a fire. Coffee was sometimes brewed from the whole beans, or they might be ground in a cloth by beating them with a rock or rifle butt. When they were ground, the usual practice was to carry them ready mixed with brown sugar. Ground or whole, green or roasted, coffee was always at the top of the soldier's menu. The soldier's bill of fare might vary with time and place, but there were certain things that could almost always be counted on, if not exactly anticipated. For Union soldiers, there was salt pork, bacon, and hardtack. Although the official designation might be bacon, the average Yank called this stuff sow belly, among other less complimentary terms. It varied considerably in age and saltiness, but it usually had to be soaked to be edible, and about the only way it could be cooked was either to broil it on a sharp stick or fry it, a process which produced a great deal of hot grease and remarkably little else. The grease was used to cook whatever else might be available, and proved especially useful as one means of softening up the other permanent food item for the Northern soldier, hardtack. Hardtack was a dense, hard-baked little biscuit or cracker, generally about 3 inches square by ½ inch thick. It was designed to keep for a long time without spoiling, an important consideration in those pre-refrigerator days. It would keep for a long time, but it also provided a home for various weevils and worms. Hardtack also, as the name implies, was hard. It reputedly got harder and harder as it got older. Stories abounded of soldiers whose lives were saved when a piece of hardtack carried in their pocket stopped a mini-ball. A well-aged chunk of hardtack presented the soldier with the challenge of how to soften it enough to eat it easily, and a variety of methods were used. Frying it in sow belly was a favorite, but sometimes it was soaked in coffee or water. Hardtack was, other than coffee, the most common and widely eaten food during the Civil War. Though not usually issued by the Southern government, considerable quantities of it fell into Southern hands. It provided a welcome break for Southern soldiers from their own usual fare of beef and cornbread. Southerners in general did not fare as well as Federal troops in the food they were given, although the stereotype of the starving Confederate has been rather exaggerated. In the early days of the war, Confederates ate as well as Yankees. Later on, as the overburdened Southern rail system gradually failed and the distribution of food became more difficult, Southern soldiers did often go hungry. The standard Confederate rations included a portion of meat. With no good means of preservation, this went bad quickly, and when it wasn't spoiled, it was often of poor quality. The other semi-permanent part of the Confederate ration was cornmeal. One common way to prepare this was to mix it with water in a cup or pan, making a mush which could be heated over the fire and mixed with chunks of meat or whatever else was handy. Another common method was to mix the meal with water and a little grease or lard, making a stiff batter or dough. A ball of this stuff was then molded around the end of a ramrod, which could be held in the fire until it was more or less cooked. The diet of the average Civil War soldier was best. Sanitary conditions were generally no better. Cooking utensils were usually cleaned by scouring them with stones or sandy dirt. Camp latrines were simply open ditches. Drinking water was taken from any handy stream or pond or puddle. During a campaign, the nearest thicket or fence served as a toilet. It's not surprising that disease killed 4 times more Civil War soldiers than were lost in battle.
When the average soldier was sick, his first reaction was usually to try to cure himself, using the home remedies he was familiar with. If this didn't work, he had no choice but to turn out for sick call and report to the regimental surgeon. Every Civil War regiment had a surgeon. While the majority were at least well-intentioned, the level of competence varied widely. Most surgeons, competent or not, too often simply found themselves trying to do too much with too little. Medical science in the 1860s hadn't yet made the link between germs and infection, so sterilizing instruments or dressings was unheard of. The variety of drugs and medicines available to the surgeon was limited. Opiates and powerful laxatives and purgatives, often made from roots and plants, were popular. Whatever their purpose or derivation, the main ingredient was usually alcohol. Civil War armies were made up primarily of men from rural backgrounds with little immunity or resistance to diseases. Early in the war, patriotic examining physicians passed as healthy thousands of men with handicaps or physical defects. Later, when both sides began conscription, many older men were taken from their settled existence and subjected to the hardships of campaigning. All these factors, combined with the state of medical care, the terrible sanitary conditions, and the soldiers' diet, created a situation in which sickness and disease ran rampant. Epidemics of measles, smallpox, and typhus were especially prevalent in new troops. Malaria was common in summer, to be replaced in winter by pneumonia and rheumatism. Dysentery and diarrhea were almost universal and killed more men than battle wounds. The treatment of wounds was on a par with the cures for disease. If the wound was in an arm or leg, amputation was often the only treatment. Sanitary standards and battlefront surgeries practically guaranteed infection. It was a rare soldier who didn't feel that it was infinitely better to die quickly from disease or to be killed outright in battle than to rely on medical care.
As long as he was healthy, though, the Civil War soldier had to be ready to handle the necessities of everyday life. To do this, he wore or carried a variety of personal gear and belongings, starting with his uniform. Uniforms in the Civil War varied enormously, especially in the early days when volunteer and militia companies made up considerable parts of both armies. Northern troops gradually acquired a much more standard uniform since their government was more efficient in issuing clothing. The standard wear for Federal infantry was the dark blue cap and coat with sky blue trousers. A leather box for cartridges hung from the left shoulder, riding at the right hip. A leather belt held a bayonet scabbard on the left side, and a small leather box for percussion caps on the right. Some small personal belongings like needle and thread, an extra button or two, soap, razor, or comb would be tucked in with the soldier's food and mess gear and carried in the haversack. The haversack was a bag made of waterproof which hung at the waist from a shoulder strap. On the march, the haversack and the canteen hung from the right shoulder, riding at the left hip. Most soldiers didn't usually carry a lot of extra clothing, certainly no more than a clean shirt and maybe a pair of socks. The Yankee carried his clothing along with a blanket or two, a shelter half, and a rubberized blanket or poncho, all in or on his knapsack. The knapsack and the musket completed the Union soldier's regular equipment. The Confederate government was never able to achieve the regularity or uniformity of the clothing issued by the Union to its soldiers. However, the stereotype of the rebel attired in rags and tatters is another popular Civil War myth that has been greatly exaggerated. The standard uniform specified by the Confederate government for its infantrymen was a gray coat and a cap with sky blue. In practice, there was wide diversity. The cap was often replaced by a slouch hat of various shapes and styles. A short jacket was favored over the long coat. The jacket and the trousers might be of any of several colors, from the prescribed medium gray to the brownish gray made from native plant dyes and called butternut, to, occasionally, the blue of captured Yankee material. The haversack held whatever food the soldier had, his cup, plate, and eating utensils, plus other small personal items, letters from home, perhaps a testament or prayer book. More adventurous or daring souls might carry cards or dice, equally common among Northerners or Southerners. The haversack also held the one important commodity the Reb always had more of than the Yank, tobacco. Whether from preference or necessity, the Confederate tended to travel light. His extra clothing, if any, was rolled up together with his blanket and ground cloth, if he had one. The ends were tied together to make a bedroll which could be thrown over the shoulder. The cartridge box hung from the left shoulder over the right hip. The Confederate belt, like the Yankees, held the bayonet on the left side, the cap box on the right. For marching, the Confederate would hang his haversack and canteen over his right shoulder to ride on the left side. The blanket roll might go on either shoulder, depending on the soldier's preference. With musket and hat in place, his equipment was complete. The most important single piece of equipment the soldier carried was, of course, his weapon. Dozens of different firearms of various styles, sizes, and calibers were Civil War soldiers at one time or another, especially in the early days of the conflict. By the end of 1862, however, virtually all infantrymen, North and South, were carrying one of two standard weapons. The .577 caliber English-made Enfield rifle musket and the .58 caliber U.S.-made Springfield rifle musket were very similar in most respects. Both were muzzle-loading percussion cap weapons with rifled barrels. Each had a maximum effective range of 400 to 500 yards. Their caliber sizes were so close that ammunition was basically interchangeable. The Springfield, made in the North, was the standard issue for Federal soldiers. Enfields brought from England through the Federal blockade were issued in considerable numbers to Southern foot soldiers, although both weapons were carried by soldiers on both sides.
Firing his musket quickly and effectively was one of the first things every Civil War soldier had to learn to do. The entire process was standardized and broken down into 9 separate movements or steps. Load and fire in the 9 times, as it was called, included the following commands.
Attention. Load in 9 times. Load. Handle cartridge. Tear cartridge. Charge cartridge. Draw rammer. Ram cartridge. Return rammer. Prime. Shoulder, arm. Ready. Aim. Fire. Shoulder, arm.
The same drill was used by soldiers of both sides. In fact, it was Confederate Lieutenant General William Hardee who, before the war, wrote the manual containing this drill and other standard infantry tactics used by both armies. Using this system, veteran troops could average 3 shots a minute. That level of proficiency was only attained by repeated practice and drilling. Drilling occupied a deal of the soldier's time, especially for new recruits. In addition to learning how to handle his weapon, the soldier had to learn the intricacies of marching and maneuvering in formation with his comrades. The infantry tactics of the day were to a large extent derived from those of the Napoleonic era. The most important element in winning battles was to get large numbers of men in the right formation to deliver massed volleys of musket fire at the enemy. What this meant for the common soldier was hours of sweaty, exhausting work, mastering the art of mass movement. But precise formation marching, like battle itself, was only called for occasionally. Marching for the Civil War soldier generally meant not maneuvering on the battlefield, but simply getting to someplace else. The armies of that wide-ranging conflict set standards of non-mechanized mobility that still leave awe today. Covering 15 miles or more in a day was considered average, not even worth comment. The most incredible pieces of marching were often done in conjunction with the heaviest fighting. The Union Army of the Potomac averaged over 20 miles a day for the 5 sweltering hot days preceding the Battle of Gettysburg. A.P. Hill's division of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia left Harper's Ferry early on the morning of September 17, 1862, covered 17 miles in 7 hours, and still played a major part in the war's single bloodiest day at Sharpsburg. This kind of marching, like much of the common soldier's everyday existence, was anything but romantic. The grim, routine reality that the Civil War soldier faced every day demanded a different kind of courage and resolution than what it took to storm a battery or charge a fortified position. Because those soldiers had both kinds of courage in abundance, our country is what it is, and we are, in some fundamental ways, what we are. We remember them with respect and gratitude.
Just before the battle, Mother, I am thinking most of you. While upon the field we're watching,